Welcome to another presentation of the Cognitive Security Institute. The views expressed by presenters are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of, or endorsement by, the Cognitive Security Institute or any affiliated organizations. Humanity stands at the threshold of an unprecedented technological revolution. Advances in AI-powered autonomous systems, direct neural interfaces, and immersive digital connectivity promise to redefine human capabilities. However, this transformation also presents profound ethical, security, and existential challenges that demand proactive and thoughtful action. The decisions we make now will shape the trajectory of our species and determine whether we thrive in this new era or falter under its weight. You may learn more about cognitive security and how to become involved in this rapidly growing community by visiting our website at cognitivesecurity.institute. If you find these talks interesting, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. We hope that you enjoy this presentation. Dalya Manatova is a doctoral researcher in security informatics at Indiana University and an Ostrom Fellow, focusing on the organizational and social dynamics of cybercriminal and outlawed communities. Her research thesis is focused on modeling the social and organizational patterns within these groups, developing methods to study their operational and social resilience. With a background in Big Four operational consulting and degrees in mathematics and computer information systems, she brings an interdisciplinary perspective to her work. Dalya has also presented and published her research at leading academic and industry venues, including Black Hat, M3AAWG, and APWG.
Hello, this is Dr. Matthew Canham, the Executive Director of the Cognitive Security Institute. Cybercriminals are people just the same as everyone else, and their organizations reflect this in their internal dynamics, which mimic those of non-criminal enterprises. This presentation to the Cognitive Security Institute explores the internal dynamics of cybercriminal organizations through the linguistic analysis of their communications as derived from leaked chat logs. We hope that you enjoy this presentation to the Cognitive Security Institute.
Thank you everyone for coming. And today I'm going to talk about my research, sort of like ongoing research that I've been working on. Relationships Matter is a sort of like a key title of it. But specifically, it's more nuanced analysis behind the organizational dynamics of a typical cybercriminal group. In this case, it's a ransomware group. So a little bit about myself. I am a doctoral researcher in security informatics, Indiana University. I'm also an Ostrom Fellow, and I study the dynamics of cybercrime networks, specifically trying to explore their formation, evolution, governance, and essentially resilience using different computational methods. I'd like to talk about how we imagine cybercrime, and specifically how it is portrayed by media. It's usually portrayed as sophisticated, employing complex techniques, or creative even, finding unexpected ways to infiltrate the system. Sometimes they even call them innovative, constantly producing new ways to avoid defense mechanisms. Even stealthy, hard to track, almost impossible to catch. Notorious, another word that people are using in media. However, in the real life, cybercriminals and cybercrime in general is pretty boring. It's organized. That's because they have to be organized to profit maximize their activities, to create brands, to standardize their activities, to coordinate their tasks. So yeah, they are pretty boring. And the researchers that actually talked about those concentration of boring jobs, such as administrators, botnet administrators, and so on. So the outline of my today presentation is I'm going to dive in a little bit what we know about cybercrime, specifically how people are choosing identities, how they build communities, and essentially how they build partnership. We're also going to talk about what makes cybercrime resilience, and we try to apply those organizational theories to figure out what can help us to understand the cybercriminal resilience. And we will dive in the specific case of a ransomware gang, where we actually try to use different methods to reconstruct those dimensions of organization. Speaking about the dimensions, I invite you to try to look at the cybercrime and understand it as a socio-technical complex system. So it has different dimensions. Technical, basically all the tools that are using, the code, the vulnerabilities, botnet structures, maybe even AI now. But also economical, right? There's also economical dimension where we can see how much money circulated there, how they are having their collaborations and connections with money mules and so on. But also social, organizational, and cultural. The rules, the norms, the actions, the coordination of tasks, people that they choose to work with, this all falls into social, organizational, but also cultural context of people that are working in this cybercriminal ecosystem. So let's talk about participants of cybercrime. So they build trust over repeated interaction, but they also usually meet online. So they have to signal this trust. And they signal trust through shared understandings, knowledge, background, cultural background, and language. Essentially what they know about their space, which culture they're coming from, and also the language they're speaking. There's a lot of examples of Russian cybercriminals usually hang out in the same Russian speaking forum, or people that are coming from the same cultural background, post-Soviet countries, for example, also tend to be collaborating together. And essentially knowledge background, which tools, which communities they were growing as a hackers or as a cyber criminals. For example, carders usually tend to kind of cluster together from the same crowd of carders. But also participants, they build communities online through this repeated interaction. And it's not like they build it online on forums, they also build it through different platforms. Discord, Telegram, Jabber, forums, and so on, maybe even more now seems to be Signal too. And e-crime communities, and I call them e-crime, not just cybercrime, because e-crime as a word existed for a very long time and actually encompasses everything, including carding and financial crimes. So they have their own social system. They have their natural connections that they build through those repeated interactions, eventually becoming friends. The structure of the forums of different platforms kind of impose this hierarchy. So they have different types of or tiers of membership. Sometimes you can pay for it, or sometimes depends how long you've been in the forum, you kind of become this in different tiers of hierarchy person. So those are reputations, right? So social validation of others that builds into the structure of hierarchy. But also essentially we can observe the patterns of communication, actual behaviors of interaction. And here's actually an example of WWH Club, the famous Russian-speaking cybercriminal forum, existed from 2012 probably, and considered one of the major Russian language carding forums. Recently, 2 admins of the forum were arrested, but the forum still exists. They kind of changed their alignment with those admins, saying that those admins were actually not admins, but just moderators, and the forum still exists. It's not associated with those admins and those arrests. So mature communities kind of create eventually those scale-free networks, meaning that there's always will be few people that are leaders, and we can observe their pattern of communications and see they're the most connected compared to the rest of the network of those communities. And that's actually from our research, this graph. We were comparing largest forum that had different types of crimes, but essentially in the forum, subforums also had the same scale-free network pattern. Even though those crime communities exist in different platforms, they also tend to cluster in different types of forums, depending on the topic, language, and even type of crime. And they also treat those forums as marketplaces. Here's a quick example of arbitration threads in Russian forum, where people are selling different dumps and even lockbit. But even though if they have clustering of different forums, they might be connected. A good example of it is SIM swapping, which essentially is classified as a pure online crime, or used to be a pure online crime. But essentially, as we enhance those defense mechanisms, we employ MFA and so on, they have to adapt. And one of the adaptation technique is actually to breach into the physical crime. In this case, actually go and recruit someone who works for retail, or steal those tablets and in a 10 minutes of the time window, basically try to swap those numbers. They call it the service remote snatching. We kind of try to holistically measure this interconnectedness of different types of crime. And in our paper, we show that even though those three major types of crime in a large form where a lot of people discuss different types of criminal activities, there still tend to be interconnectedness. At least 30% of the time, users will be connected to a different type of crime, although they have a pretty different structure from the social network of those users, and they have a different strength of resilience of those networks. So e-crime participants are utilizing multiple identities, but they also build branding tied to such identities. They choose nicknames according to those identities, and they essentially collaborate based on those identities. Here's a quick example from the book by Jonathan Lasthouse. He essentially was interviewing former cybercriminal, and the cybercriminal basically was saying that, yeah, he was using different identities for different types of businesses. So that means that there should be some coordination, and that's what essentially we see now. We see that there is partnership and hierarchy in the groups to facilitate this sophistication of attacks, but not sophistication in the term that they're more smarter. It's just a lot more organized. So they have to organize their activities, and they have to be resilient in order to constantly producing those attacks, even though we are building defense mechanism or try to prosecute those who are involved in a large scale of cybercrime. So e-crime communities are actually becoming organizations, and organizations with different types of roles, tasks, and essentially depending on the scale which they operate, it could be just attacking large infrastructures or just small businesses, or scope, range of different activities. Are those people that are just producing phishing kits, or are those people actually building the whole infrastructure, such as ransomware as a service? And essentially social networks, actual communication patterns between people, because criminals are people. And even though they have different roles and tasks, the patterns of actual communication might differ. And essentially they build resilience because they want to keep their businesses. They want to keep the partnership in this environment. So I invite you to try to understand sustainable e-crime using organizational theories, linguistic analysis, and social network science. Because essentially their task management is attack chain of the victims. So I showed that cybercrime groups are business organizations. So let's study them as such, right? We refer to organizational science to try to derive what is organization, what makes an organization a successful, sustainable organization. And it turns out there are major 5 traits of 5 dimensions that help the organization to sustain, such as structure, sometimes even hierarchical structure. So there should be some degree of authority at different levels, and there should be a specialized structure. So it's not just out of blue authority or structure or hierarchy, but it should make sense to coordinate activities or to manage activities. Activities also have to be tied to specific roles or individuals. So there's some sort of a specialization, task modularity. They also have to be a shared rational goal. So there should be a clear goal direction for the whole organizational system. So everyone on board understanding what's the purpose of the organization. And essentially rules and norms, formal or informal guidelines for actions, acceptable or not behaviors that are associated with the membership. For example, in some of the ransomware groups, it was not acceptable to attack healthcare system, even child healthcare system. But some of them broke the rules, and essentially that rule sort of became soft rule. And finally, probably the most important dimension is actually relationships between people, those interpersonal connections that people build within the organization. We also refer to organizational science to try to understand how those dimensions interplay in the resilience of the organization. Turns out that we can understand three types of resilience. The functional one is focus on the ability of a specific part of the organization, a specific task modularity of the system to function. It's not going to break the entire organization, but that specific task, that specific group might be suffering. In this case, let's say if you are building a ransomware gang and you have a group of developers that are just developing a specific backdoor on a specific system, on a Windows machine or old Windows machine, and that group for some reason has an issue. The whole group, the whole organization still can function. It's just that specific function is not working right now. Essentially, operational resilience, that's actually breaching to several groups within the organization. This is focus and ability to continue the entire organizational operation. And the larger one is actually strategic resilience. That's is focused on the long-term survival of the whole organization as environment changes. The good example is Russian invasion of Ukraine. The whole political agenda changed in the country. Economic situation also changed. So this environment changed. That's how the actual strategic resilience also changes. So we say e-crime is industrialized enough so we can actually try and study it as an organization. But how can we do it? How can we understand criminals? There are few things that we have to keep in mind. When we try to read their interaction in the forums or in textual chats, there's a problem with understanding jargon, slang or technical jargon. So specific words they're using, a specific way they're speaking. Share culture, even though we try to understand the jargon, we still might have a barrier understanding their culture. How they signal trust or how they build their relationships, what are the social norms are there? And essentially, shared context. The assumptions that we think we might know, but we actually might not know because we don't have this shared constant that the context that people are having in the group. All right, so here's an example of a jargon that we might miss. This is a machine translation using deep learning of a selection of different messages. Some of the messages are translated incorrectly, and we can see that. But also some of the messages translated incorrectly and change completely or entirely the purpose of the message. In this case, this person is saying, unsubscribe user 6. They're already spamming the email and the form there. So it sounds like a person is saying, try to delete the user 6. But what we're actually saying is try to reply to user 6 because they're already spamming the email and the website form. So yeah, also understanding shared humor, which contributes overall into the understanding the cultural context. In this specific case, humor gives us the whole contextual culture understanding of the group. I'm sorry, my cat is trying to get in the picture. All right. So analysis of a humor requires more than translation. And there have been research that showed that understanding humor is actually pretty hard. And even if you do try to translate it, if you're not coming from the same cultural context, it's really hard to understand the humoristic part of it. All right, in this case, on the Fatherland Defenders Day, everyone is celebrating this day, saying everyone happy holidays. But if we look at this specific message, happy holidays, cyber troops, let's beat the aimers, the correct translation will be, the more accurate translation will be not beat, but more banned, which actually indicates a homophobic violence and also kind of aligns with a specific domestic political ideology in terms of targeted towards Western countries, specifically Americans. So in this case, it kind of informs the target selection. And the fact that they're using cyber troops and addressing themselves as cyber troops also tells us something. Sometimes shared understanding might not be aligned with the goals of the group. For example, in one of the replies to that message, one of the users said, "Oh, all who are involved are not, but peace to all of us. Let's let the bot fights, we have more power over them." What actually the person is trying to say, he kind of tries to disagree with the political subtext and also attempting to de-escalate his disagreement, adding extra 2 smiles at the end. By the way, those parentheses actual smiles. So de-escalating with this hedging. So yeah, so threat analysis includes culture and context. And a lot of people suspected that Russian cybercriminal groups usually have some sort of a unspoken rule with the Russian government. But with context, we can actually see that they officially announced full support of Russian government on the day of the invasion of Ukraine, actually a couple days after. But if we look at the chats long before that, we can actually see that there was a collaboration, or at least some sort of a relationship with the state. A regional expert looking for the chat quickly can notice this address corresponds to FSB. So discussions including words like journalist or name Alexei also give a hint about the situation, the context of the whole conversation. So that tells us that there's some sort of a relationship existed long before they aligned their forces with Russian government. Conti is actually pretty great study, pretty great case. Not because it's one of the major ransomware groups and probably one of the main profitable ones out there, but also because it has proven resilience as a threat under different names. So Conti existed a while ago as a group of people. And back in 2014, they started as a dire by banking Trojans. And 2015, they partially got disrupted by Russian law enforcement. And then they kind of rebranded. That's exactly when the TrickBot appeared. And we can infer that TrickBot is the same as Dire because there have been similarities with the code. They had the same developers and so on. And then in 2018, when ransomware started popping up, Ryuk appeared. And then Ryuk went offline 2020. That's when Conti appeared. And essentially, Conti declared support in 2022. That's what this major leak appeared. Thanks to that major leak, we can actually study into different pieces of this group. But do you actually think that the group just disappeared after this data leak? No, they actually continue to operate, then eventually rebranded, and there are traces to different groups now, such as Paracord, Zion, Black Suit, Black Basta, and recently I found out about Akira. So understanding this resilience, social resilience and organizational resilience, help us to try to understand what's going on behind the code, how people are constantly reforming, rebranding. Even if we try to prosecute them, they kind of come back and appear again. If we try to build social graph of Conti, not actually looking closely to the messages yet, but just do this like exercise of building social graph, we quickly see the same scale-free pattern. I mean, overall, there have been at least 500 people or users that were in this group space. And if we try to measure different statistical measures, including social network measures, but also time span of the users or how long the frequency of messages and so on, we can quickly see the distribution of 3-tier memberships. Clear division. Managers and leaders, those are like on top, those 5 people. They're highly connected. They sort of oversee the whole workflow, although they might have different sort of roles in the group. There's also upper level members and lower level members. And upper level members have longer lifespans compared to the lower level members. And they seem to have more established positions ranging from software development to very boring administrative roles. And also lower level members. They usually have higher turnover rate, they have little connectivity to the rest of the graph. Some of them actually contractor positions. To look closely at their network measurements, we can see that everyone who appears to be leaders are pretty much having higher betweenness centrality, meaning they're acting as a breach of information. So trying to coordinate and control the flow of information of the group. But the clustering coefficient is higher for the second tier membership, which means there are more interconnected members of the second tier membership than the leaders and the managers. So we actually tried to look what's going on, more nuanced analysis of their communications and relationships. And we again refer to organization science when we try to think how people are building relationships in the group. Turns out, if you are organizing your activities and you've been quite long enough in the organization, you will eventually develop 3 types of relationships: influence, workflow, and expressive. We call it friendships. So essentially, relationships are kind of discerned from the conversations about work that are more related to personal information, to even social invitations, and so on. But we also divide influence. Apart from workflow, we can see that influence could be, there could be play of a power dynamic. So a hierarchy of work tasks, or there could be sharing of expertise or provision of advice. So this mentorship relationship is a little bit different compared to authority. It's more of a authority based on expertise or knowledge, where you ask someone to mentor you, or you sort of try to share your knowledge with someone who is lower in the rank, so you become a mentor yourself. So how we can try to extract those relationships from the textual communication? Well, we can refer to linguistic analysis and look closely at the textual communication and try to figure out each utterance or each message, what the person is saying. And then we can quickly figure out, okay, the person might ask a question, but what's the purpose of the question, or what is intention? Those are called speech acts, or illocutionary speech acts, trying to figure out what the intention behind the message that has been sent. In this case, the person is asking, oh, shall we make where a scripter with a PDF icon for Bitcoin? Pretty vague, right? This is also a Russian original text. So not quite sure, is this a question? Is this a suggestion or request for approval? But in a context, if you read the message, you will see that this is actually a request for approval. This is a pretty easy one case. In this case, buddy, can the submission wait until tomorrow? I can't, falling asleep. So again, it's a question, but the intention of the question is to ask for approval. So we try to extract those intentions, speech acts, based on the textual communication, and we divide those speech acts in 3 major types. Speech acts are related to work routine, such as status update request, status update report. So someone is actually requesting status updates, someone is reporting. Task assignment or work order, or if you're just passing information through, just sending some files. This is also has been in the chats. Or requesting for approval, as we saw in the previous cases. And intentions like that. Intentions related to personal trust, which we attribute to friendships, usually are having communications related to sharing opinion, sharing personal information, sometimes even giving your real name, which is in the environment of a cybercriminal group where everyone is addressing each other with the usernames. Sharing name is actually breaking this anonymity. Or even social invitations. We see that too when they invite each other to weddings, birthday parties, or social gatherings. Knowledge and expertise sharing, that's something that we attribute to mentorship, such as someone is requesting for help, or someone is providing advice, or sharing their knowledge, or helping the other person. Another thing that we try to capture in the textual communications is lack of reciprocity or no reply. So we annotate the messages based on those reciprocity markers. For example, in this case, the person is, oh, when you have time, when you have a minute, ping me, please. That's one message. After a few, maybe 10 minutes, the person is like, I'm having a misunderstanding with the encoding of files in the back door. And then at the end, he has a smile, sort of like a hedging. Tries to explain why he's pinging that person. No reply. And then he's like, need your help. I need your help. Well, there was no reply to those 3 messages at all. And the responder was replying after a few hours with a completely different message. Hello, everyone. Does anyone know? Like completely not related to what the person was asking before. So this lack of reciprocity, or in this case, no reply, tells us something. And in a lot of cases, person who is in a higher position or a boss have this luxury not to reply right away, or maybe not even reply at all, ignore the request. Because there's so much going on for the person in the managing position, they just have to prioritize, and some of the things they prioritize lower. Another thing that we try to capture in textual communication is actual tone. So you might say something or you might text something, but with a specific intention, you also try to soften or maybe even give emotional context of the message. In this case, the person is pretty clearly has an apologetic tone. Sorry for the persistent reminder. In this case, the person is like, how would I know? And then he tries to hedge his statement. This is your requirement. And then he kind of smiles in. So we also try to capture that. So in a sense, we try to annotate messages based on those linguistic markers and intention markers to try and map those all markers into those relationships that I talked about. Sometimes they might mention explicit hierarchy, saying like, oh, hi boss. So in this case, we can pretty clearly see this is a formal addressing. In some of the languages, the plurality of the verbs or other words could actually also mean that this is a formal addressing. In Russian, it does exist too. Sometimes they actually mention relative roles. So someone can say, oh, mentee, or hey, boss, as I mentioned before. As I mentioned before, reciprocity, we also capture that. We also capture use of real names and linguistic markers, apologetic, command, hedging, politeness, respect, and so on. So here's a quick example how would a relationship type authority would look like. So we try to capture all of those markers and build this confidence interval based on those code distribution. And we build this hierarchy between 2 people. So codes like work order, task assignment, status update request will appear most likely in a higher distribution of codes for someone who is in an authoritative position, compared to the other way around, where the person having more code distribution in the conversation with this authoritative person requesting for supervisor approval or reporting a status update, even having formal addressing and tones such as apologetic, politeness, thankfulness, hedging, and even plea. Here's a quick example. Here in this case, Stern and Defender are talking, and we see that Stern is giving a work order. Actually, example where he is asking to make sure that Defender sets up the system by the deadline. And Defender is actually accepting the work order. And we can also see that it's pretty straightforward. Stern is giving additional work orders on top of that. Here is a little bit complicated example. We can see that here's Badgett and Bentley are discussing a request for work order. But we can also see that Badgett is using a formal addressing, calling him, hi, buddy, but also adds hedging to kind of try to soften his forthcoming or like friendliness. So he adds those smiles at the end to soften his question. Relationship type mentorship is pretty much straightforward whenever a person is asking for help or whenever the other person who is a mentor is offering help or suggestion. Here's a quick example when Zolotoy is asking for help, asking with the hedging actually. Do we have anyone for Citrix? Need to secure access. And then he kind of explains, elaborates with the hedging, just don't know who to write. Sorry if you are a wrong person. So we can see this as a little bit of influence dynamics between those two people. So relationship type friendship this is where we attribute all those non-work related topics: opinion sharing, personal information sharing, informal addressing, small talk, when they talk about things not related to actual work or just like sharing different types of news. Here's a quick example. Again, Bentley and Badgett are discussing personal matters, in this case, actually games. And we can see that here in this case, Badgett is sharing personal information that he has been playing Witcher and also completed playing Greek Assassin. We can also see that Bentley is showing some excitement because he loves playing Civilization himself and also shares information on what kind of games he likes to play. So that's something we can see this is a marker or attribute to a friendship building. And that essentially gives us the whole potential initial social graph of the person who is Badgett. We identify him as a developer. And we can see those three major types of relationships that he has. Authority, we can pretty clearly see the Stern is a manager, and you saw him in a different graph too. We can see this green arrow pointing out that the Stern is manager for Badgett. He's a clear authority. But we can also see that other people are also sort of like having a authoritative relationship with Badgett. We can also see that Badgett is a authoritative person himself to someone called Globus, which appears to be also a developer and seems like a less mature developer compared to Badgett. Mentorship is a completely different graph, as we can see. We can see that Stern is no more mentor. We don't see the arrow pointing out to Badgett, but we see a different person here, Hoff, who is also seem to be bot harder and seems to also work for TrickBot. As a note, TrickBot and Conti seem to have shared membership, so there's a lot of overlap between members of TrickBot and Conti. We can also see that Badgett himself is a mentor to someone who's Logan, whose role we cannot really identify because not that much of a communications where we can attribute the role yet. And friendship, we can see how Badgett is a pretty friendly guy. And when he's friendly, other people also respond to his friendliness. In that case, Hoff, Stern, Bentley. So essentially, we have the social graphs. So what does it tell us? Well, we can attribute those relationships to members and essentially try to reconstruct their subcommunities based on those relationships. We can also analyze their workflows. And based on those workflows, we can define the roles for different users. And since they already have a social structure, we can see how they kind of form work groups. So how can we understand that? We can look at the tasks. Depending on different types of crime, there'll be different division of tasks, right? So that someone who's producing DDoS attacks or ransomware or SIM swapping, you'll have a different range of tasks. And essentially those tasks will be attached to roles, and that will depend on the type of organization, the scope, maybe target size, maybe a specific specialization of the group. And essentially workflows, we can see how people are passing information and how they work in the day-to-day environment, depending on the organization, context, and the crime. In Conti case, they do have different roles. They even have a whole victim support. They have people that are in charge of negotiating with the victim in the specific form. How can we extract those specializations, those roles? Well, we already attributed those work routine intention messages. We can extract themes and topics of those information flow and workflow routines. Sometimes they actually explicitly mention their roles, and sometimes just looking at the mentioning of a specific process, we can extract, okay, this person is more involved in this process, or this person have a distribution of those processes. So maybe that person is more attributed to those processes. That means that the person is actually involved in that role. In this case, we give example of testing. So testers is a pretty clear role in this group, and they actually do what it sounds like. They test the malware on different systems to make sure it's actually working before they give it to our client. So we can actually break down the production, and this is pretty clear. Target identification, production of actual ransomware, attack preparation, execution of attack, negotiation, essentially data restoration, and victim support. But this one, infrastructure maintenance, is actually pretty important. It's making sure that's provide this whole infrastructure for everyone. So those backend developers, group administrators, those people that are admins and provide infrastructure, they provide the functionality of the whole group's technical actions. And the different people might involve in different production or different tasks. Some of them might involve in several, but essentially like target identification and selections, that's where the researchers, OSINT researchers, are access brokers, trying to profile and identify the target. And eventually production of ransomware, that's where all the developers and more technical people are, such as malware developers, coders, testers, Cobalt Strike configurers, reverse engineers, sometimes even all in once. So they develop, they test ransomware, and then essentially when the attack actually about to happen, that's where all the negotiation with the affiliate or affiliate managers is happening. And that's where a lot of negotiation of the botnet suppliers is happening. So making sure that secure access to the victim network and essentially successful data encryption and potential extraction of the victim from the victim network. In negotiation, that's where the leaders are coming in. That's where the ransom negotiators sometimes come in, OSINT researchers too. And eventually, after the whole attack cycle, there's this task is reflection and adaptation. When managers sort of like from top down, collecting feedback, trying to figure out in which parts, which actions went wrong and what could be improved. Even looking back at the negotiation, trying to figure out what is the best action next time. So that's where the resilience and reflection coming from. So what I'm trying to say is that we can measure the structure with different dimensions and different attributes of people and relationships. We can measure how much these social graphs are hierarchical. We can also measure how much they're resilient. And in some of the cases, we can actually detect communities of specialization. We haven't tried yet holistically or rigorously on Conti yet, but we have built a different study on 5 major hacking and cybercriminal forums, trying to test different community detection algorithms and try to figure out how much they agree and what they find. And turns out that a pretty promising algorithmic approach is core expansion, where the labels or the community membership is expanded through neighborhood label propagation. And we can actually find those communities of specialization. In this case, we qualitatively looked at the community and we figured out, oh, those people actually are connected because they're all discussing this x64 debugger. So they have this like specialization in this specific debugger. So concluding, I'll try to say that we need to understand crime. We need to understand threats to understand the operations and data, but also we need to understand the risks. Different industries have different risks, but also we need to re-evaluate the decisions based on the e-crime landscape, understanding how groups are built, how resilience are built. So reevaluating the decision of, for example, talking about insurance, will that make a company more risky as a profile for the future attacks or not? So yeah, I try to look at the e-crime as businesses and try to understand the organizational characteristics of cyber criminals, essentially to figure out how they keep coming back. And it seems like relationships play a huge role in this, but also not just simple relationship, but also different types of roles they play in those relationships. And hopefully what I'm trying to do is actually try to build computationally. So once the whole labeling of those conversations is done, the idea is actually building it on top of LLMs, which we also try to do, and there's a promising result in that too. So this is it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation to the Cognitive Security Institute. You may learn more about topics in cognitive security by visiting us at cognitivesecurity.institute.